when can conflict be initiated? Let's just start with the abduction of the Israeli soldiers, going across the border into Israel to abduct soldiers. So first with Hamas crossing Gaza to abduct Israeli soldiers. As an isolated event, you could possibly consider this illegal, but the better view would, you'd have to see this in the context of a tit for tat, or just response to prior provocations of Israel and a back and forth. So this probably would count as a proportionate response. In Hezbollah's case, crossing the border from Lebanon into Israel, the dominant view here is this one probably is illegal. Looking then to Israel's response, so the massive bombings, sealing of borders in particular. Certainly the dominant view here is that Israel had a right to respond diplomatically. I mean, that's the idea. You go to the United Nations and you make complaints and you pursue diplomatic channels with Lebanon. One could hearken back to an older customary version of international law and say, well, maybe it could do a proportionate response, such as trying to rescue the soldiers, if that's possible, or even just some sort of proportionate military response. But even under, I think, this very generous standard toward Israel, it certainly far surpasses any ordinary legal interpretation to call Israel's response a proportionate response. So even, I think, under very conservative principles that give benefits of doubt, there's really no defense of Israel's response. Okay, so now turning to laws of acceptable warfare, so jus in bello. What about the Hamas and Hezbollah attacks into Israel? So basically bombings that kill and injure both Israeli civilians, Israeli soldiers. Well, for here we can turn to customary international humanitarian law and Geneva III provisions on the conflict between state and non-state actors. In short, this requires careful discrimination between civilian and military targets. Most of the rocket attacks into Israel are illegal given their indiscriminate nature, insomuch as they are attacks on military posts. And so all the attacks on Israeli soldiers, those are acceptable forms of warfare. So, as sort of a conclusion there, we can say, yes, some war crimes have been committed, fairly minor, relatively speaking. Certainly the U.S. NATO intervention in Kosovo did far worse. Okay, turning to the Israeli attacks. So killings of many civilians, killings of belligerents, devastation to the infrastructure in Gaza and Lebanon, and massive displacement of people, so beyond 500,000 in Lebanon. Again, the same standards apply. So international humanitarian law, Geneva III provisions. And so a similar idea that civilian sites, like residential areas, are prohibited from the attack unless it can be proved that they've been converted into military uses. The burden of proof is on the attacker to show that. Where sites are of dual use, meaning some military activities are taking place, but it's also being used for normal civilian use, there's a demanding standard on the attacker. They need to establish that they've minimized loss to civilian services, civilian lives, and establish that the military value far exceeds the civilian cost. These can be subject to great debate in the specifics, but a number of the Israeli actions defy any sort of debate. So certainly collective punishment, which is a pretty explicit effort to impose just massive, desperate conditions on the civilian population until they give in, is no question illegal, certainly causing massive displacements, attack of the power plants. I mean, even the United Nations, which is fairly diplomatic about this, has called this war crimes. And so I think we can conclude here that these are major war crimes, and we have the case where UN officials, while they may not use that term, are diplomatically saying that these are major war crimes. All right, so that's sort of a quick legal primer. What can the United Nations do? Especially since we know that the United States can and will block any of the more desirable initiatives. So one thing that's technically in their power, particularly in the UN Security Council's power, is peace enforcement. This is their most powerful device where they can use coercive force to force belligerents to end their threat to international peace or security. This requires the consent of all 5 of the permanent members. As we know, the United States is one of the permanent members. It's rarely been used, a little bit more since the end of the Cold War. When it's done, it's not UN blue helmets that are doing it. It's the UN Security Council is just giving its blessing to a coalition of the willing. So often that's been the United States to do as it sees fit to remove the threat to peace and security. There's been this recent proposal out there by Israel and the United States to use this power of the coercive use of force to force Hezbollah to disarm. So the idea is to basically, I think, sucker European members of NATO. Maybe you can get some Arab states to go along. Perhaps you can convince India and Sri Lanka to use their soldiers. The reaction here is, the response is that this just won't work. We know Hezbollah is not going to submit to something so one-sided. As soon as they don't submit, the United States is going to have no hesitancy to resume the attack. As we've seen, they have no qualms about attacking UN bases. So who would want to be a UN blue helmet in that kind of crossfire? So it's a fanciful idea. I think it's deliberately meant to be unrealistic. There are perhaps seemingly more appealing proposals of how to use peace enforcement. Is bring in a force that will make Israel and the other belligerents stop fighting. As we know, it's Israel that in particular does not want to stop the fighting yet. I think this would be nice, but it's not going to happen. As we know, the United States is going to block it. And I would submit that even if some miracle occurred, that the United States government decided to go along, again, you'd have to ask, what lunatic would take part in an operation to force an unwilling Israel to cooperate? So I think the whole idea of UN Security Council peace enforcement is a non-starter. It certainly doesn't even have a good record elsewhere, as seen in the Balkans and Somalia. Option 2 is going with peacekeeping. Peacekeeping does involve blue helmets, so actually under UN control, going in after the belligerents have negotiated a ceasefire. So the UN troops provide a buffer to keep the peace, nothing really coercive. This, I submit, has an impressive historical record, even if its goals are relatively modest. It's actually, comes out of the Uniting for Peace resolution. Here it would have to come in after a mutual agreement between particularly Israel, Hamas, and Hezbollah to do a ceasefire. We know what's been stopping this, Israel and the United States. The only way to get even to the peacekeeping is if either A, the United States puts pressure on Israel to stop, or B, there's internal Israeli pressure that it needs to stop. I think actually peacekeeping is going to happen at some point. Sadly, though, it's only going to happen after Israel decides it's really inflicted enough suffering to, quote, make its point, and endures enough that it will finally stop. So unfortunately, even this is very unsatisfying, even though it is what will end the current hostilities. So what else can the UN and the global community more broadly do that is more satisfying? Marjorie has an excellent idea about invoking the General Assembly's Uniting for Peace resolution. So just to kind of add to that, the UN, including the Secretary General, or especially so, can serve as a bully pulpit to call for comprehensive negotiations that in particular take seriously a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders, so not based on a Greater Jerusalem, that condemns war crimes. While it's not likely we're going to see international prosecution of the war crimes, certainly they can begin with a fact-finding commission on war crimes. And they can request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the behavior, on the alleged war crimes. This is what they did, of course, with the wall. All right, so that's the idea. My conclusion, don't look, unfortunately, to international law as a knight in shining armor. But I think it can provide guidance and inspiration, follows up on what Fareed said. It's one way of us being a conscience to our governments who aren't going to respond to morality or law, certainly not the United States. And then it comes down to this old-fashioned political mobilization. This is especially pivotal in the United States to turn the tide. To take us out on something somewhat optimistic, there is very consistent and robust polling data that shows high United States public support, so among the public, for international law and international diplomacy. So perhaps that's something to work with. Thank you.
One thing, about 40 years ago, 1967, about 40 years ago, in 6 days, the Israeli army destroyed the armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, occupied all of the Sinai Strip, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, killed thousands of soldiers in those Arab armies, all in 6 days. It accomplished most of it actually in 1 day, in about 6 hours. Today, after 14 days of punishing bombardment of Lebanon and Palestinian areas, the Israeli army has not been able to progress more than 10 kilometers into Lebanon. The good news is that the Middle East has changed. There is a much different force of resistance. The bad news is the way Israel responds to this is by much more severe destruction and against civilians, targeting civilians. I don't know what to make of this. That's just, to me, a starking fact. The second thing is, I know that many people criticize the timing of Hezbollah. It's fair to ask, would any timing have worked? If Hezbollah had, and I don't like the term abduction, although legally maybe it is the term, but they captured 2 Israeli soldiers. Certainly Israel is still at war with Lebanon. Israel still occupies parts of Lebanon, and Israel still has Lebanese prisoners that have been in prison for more than 28 years, and nobody has called for their release. So definitely Lebanon has the right to capture Israeli soldiers to trade for its prisoners. So I don't know what the timing means, but I know that most people who criticize the timing would have criticized any timing. The third thing is, don't forget oil. As Noam Chomsky was just telling us 2 days ago, he was on an interview on Al Jazeera, because he's banned from American TV. He kept reminding us that this is still about oil. Why it's about oil? There is a plan to dominate the energy sources of the world. That is a clear plan of the US, and it's so clear that so many people cannot think it is happening. But it is happening, and so the US, with Israel's help, wants to destroy any possibility of a resistance for a complete domination of energy sources through the coalition of the Saudi government and other governments in the area, but direct military presence in the US. So that's why they call Hezbollah terrorists, because it's one of the spoilers of this plan. The last thing is it's really, I started writing an article. I'm not a good writer, so I didn't really publish it because it doesn't make sense, but I called it the Israel's Whores and the Orgy of Vampires. And I wrote this in disgust after seeing Hillary Clinton lead a rally on July 14th, 13th it was, to kiss Israel's ass. Sorry for the word, but that's what she was doing, worrying about Jewish votes. And then every senator and politician and governor followed suit to organize rallies in their towns and cities in defense of Israel. And then the chief vampire, Condoleezza Rice, with a stone-faced smile, talking about the killings of hundreds of people and destruction of a country, says it's still not time for a ceasefire. And all of these people are marching to the same tune. This really, I don't know what to call it, so I called it just the March of Whores for an orgy of vampires. That's what's happening in this country. And I call this the Israelization of US foreign policy in the Middle East. The US cannot see the Middle East now except through Israeli eyes. So only Israel is a country that's civilized enough to be worth defending. Only Israeli Jews have lives that are equal to ours. And only Israel has the right for military superiority in that area. Anything that doesn't fit in this picture is either a terrorist or an axis of evil, and so on and so forth. And we really have to be aware of this. This is what's happening. It's been happening since '67, and now it's almost complete. I mean, you see the whole political establishment in the US that cannot agree on anything, Everybody agrees on one thing: blindly supporting Israel at a time that it's killing civilians intentionally to blackmail the Arab world. That's what's happening now.
I think there are two ways to look at Israeli. I mean, that probably doesn't cover all the Israeli motives that one can come up with, but there are two to think about. I think one has to do with, ever since the Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon, Israelis have been distressed by the fact that their unilateral withdrawal was interpreted by Hezbollah and was used by Hezbollah, of course, as a victory, as a victory of their resistance. For the Israelis, that's a nightmare. Especially a nightmare because they saw Palestinian resistance movements using that model and in fact relying on that model at the beginning of the Second Intifada, saying that's what worked with Hezbollah, that's the path we must follow. I think for the Israelis it's very important, therefore, to demonstrate that this argument doesn't work. So that's why they are after Hezbollah. I think that's one reason why they're after Hezbollah with a vengeance, and in fact looked for the pretext after the abduction of the soldiers in order to prove that point, because they think that the example of Hezbollah has created other problems for them in Gaza and West Bank. The other way to explain the Israeli escalation of this conflict is, I think, to look at the makeup of the current Israeli government. The current Israeli government is a center-left government with very few military credentials of its members, and I think one way to prove how great of how good they are and to gain more popularity, I think they'd have to be very harsh in their response to Palestinian and Lebanese actions. So the more Arabs they kill, the more popular they hope they can become. And I think the reason that they are interested in this is because, and this might or might not, this is probably something that's probably more controversial than I intended to open up at this point. I actually think that this current Israeli government intends fully to withdraw from certain parts of the West Bank and to dismantle a few settlements and to make the barrier the permanent border of Israel. And in order to fulfill that, which I think for Palestinians should be seen as the worst possible nightmare, I think the worst possible nightmare for Palestinians is a unilateral Israeli withdrawal to the barrier, because then even in the eyes of the world they will have no case to make that anybody will take seriously that they remain an occupied people. So I think precisely because this government intends fully to undertake a unilateral withdrawal towards the barrier and to annex all of Jerusalem, all of the greater Jerusalem, etc., etc. For that reason, it doesn't, and it also doesn't have the military credentials. It has to prove itself particularly hard, and I think this is all being proved on the bodies of Lebanese and Palestinians in Gaza and Lebanon. Armed struggle. Of course, Palestinians have the right to resistance by arms. I just think it's a totally failed strategy.
But how can you negotiate a settlement without...
I think this is you know, what you're asking is, how do you negotiate when you're weak? This is a very serious challenge, of course. Unfortunately, armed struggle doesn't make you strong. Unfortunately, armed struggle only within very specific contexts can exert some leverage that will allow you to then, I mean, for example, the first Intifada. The first Intifada was violent, but it was controlled violence. Yeah? The first Intifada was the kind of violence that allowed Palestinians to make themselves, to gain sort of a false strength for themselves that allows them to gain a better negotiating position. I think the second Intifada is an unmitigated disaster in terms of strategy. It has so depreciated Palestinians' ability to negotiate a better settlement, so that today, armed resistance in Palestine, to me, from my point of view, especially after September 11th, when all that means is that the Americans and the rest of the world put you on the side of the terrorists, it's an unmitigated disaster at this point. Palestinians don't have the option of an armed resistance. It's not a question of right. It's a question of what might have the possible slight chance of working.
The question was about the Iraqis going into Syria, fleeing Iraq to go into Syria. How is Syria treating those Iraqis?
Well, despite pressure by the U.S. government, Syria is not closing its border, and it is allowing Iraqis to come in so far without restriction. In terms of how their treatment is inside Syria, I think they're being treated well by and large. There have been isolated instances, with new refugee groups coming in of some minor problems, but by and large they are being treated well. They tend to congregate in certain areas, particularly in Damascus. An area called Jaramana is virtually all Iraqi refugees at this point. But they are assimilating into the society. I don't think they really intend to stay long term. I think most of the Iraqis in Syria hope to go back home within a short period of time. I don't know if that's realistic or not. And they are being granted some type of residency, but they have to pay a $2,000, I guess, in insurance that they have to deposit with the labor ministry or something like that. And that allows them to work legally in Syria.
One thing that I don't think has been mentioned in this discussion, it's not just a binary thing, whether you have armed resistance or negotiations. There is something called civil actions and civil resistance, like South Africa. That's an example where military action coupled with a huge campaign around the world to impose sanctions and boycott of South Africa did lead to a position where the ANC was able to negotiate a very principled and wonderful outcome. I think what we're missing, and what the Israeli government is trying desperately to prevent any actions, those people are calling for boycott against Israel. There is a boycott movement that is growing quite rapidly in Europe specifically. It's calling for boycotting all Israeli institutions, from academia to economics and so on. And that is a non-violent form of resistance. We have the right to boycott anybody. That's a non-violent form of resistance. It sounds very idealistic at this point, but so did South Africa in 1985. I was a student, and the struggle then in anti-apartheid sounded very idealistic. By the end of the 80s, it was over. They had succeeded. So I think of other forms of resistance. There are many other forms. So the question was about the US brands Hezbollah as a terrorist organization because they believe that Hezbollah was responsible for bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut that killed 220 or something like that US Marines, and also an attack on the US Embassy where Hezbollah said there were 25 CIA agents in Lebanon at that time.
I'm not an expert, and you probably could comment more effectively than I could on this, but one of the things that the US government likes to do and the Israeli government is to portray their enemy of the day as terrorists, and the Iraqis as insurgents. As opposed to a resistance movement against occupation. I mean, let me give you a quick hypothetical. Let's say that, and then I'll come back to your question. Let's say that China looked at the United States and saw that, well, we are fighting a war of aggression, an illegal war of aggression in Iraq. And there is a huge number of people in this country that live in poverty, millions without health care, our elections are fixed, and they decided that they really wanted to bring democracy to the American people and that we needed a regime change. And so let's say that China invaded the United States to change our regime and thought, of course, they'd be greeted with flowers. What would we do? Well, we'd probably resist a foreign occupation. And that's exactly what the Iraqis are doing, and that's exactly what the Palestinians are doing, and that's exactly what the Lebanese are doing. Now, where does that lead us? Well, what is a terrorist? It's, and if you watch not just Fox, but CNN and MSNBC and all the rest, they paint anyone who is in opposition to the Bush administration as a terrorist. My definition, and I wrote an article for the Arab Studies Quarterly a few years ago about defining terrorism, and there are all kinds of terrorism. There's state-sponsored terrorism, there's international terrorism, there's individual terrorism. My definition of a terrorist is someone who targets civilians, who kills civilians. So if you have an organization or a government or a fighting force that is targeting a military operations, such as happened in Beirut. That, to me, is not terrorism. Now, that's my own definition, and some people might disagree. But when you target civilians, I think that's terrorist. And so, of course, that leads us to a position very different from what the Bush administration has taken. And that doesn't really answer your question. Maybe you can talk more specifically about this incident that he's talking about.
My husband and I and our 2 kids were in Beirut a year ago at the first half of 2005. And after the Hariri assassination, there were checkpoints that were set up throughout the city by the Lebanese Army, whose leadership was implicated in the Hariri assassination. I'm not a Hezbollah supporter. I'm not a Hamas supporter. I don't particularly like what Syria did to Lebanon all these years. But on our street, they set up a checkpoint, and it was the Lebanese Army. And everybody knows it's weak and thoroughly corrupt to the bone. Nobody trusts it. Nobody feels safe. In fact, there were stories about if they set up a checkpoint in your street, that means you're going to be the next target. And I remember talking to my neighbor, who was Sunni, and a few other people, and we said, now, if they put a Hezbollah checkpoint on the street, then I'd feel safe. So even though I have no allegiance to these groups, I have tremendous respect for them because I know that they will actually try to protect me if they could. That if they had something there, then the Lebanese Army would fear them and wouldn't do what it had been doing in many areas during our stay, which was bombing businesses at night, usually causing no casualties. But, this is the situation, so you just think in terms of survival in these situations. We need to be very educated and somehow help the Palestinian and the Lebanese leadership stay on the path of sticking to principles. Just like in South Africa, Nelson Mandela, over and over again, he said one thing: one man, one vote. One man, one vote. One man, one vote. When Yasser Arafat was negotiating with the Israelis, he didn't say, you know what, let's negotiate about this territory or that territory after you stop home demolitions. Then he could have said it every day: stop home demolitions, stop home demolitions, stop home demolitions. That would have been a lot smarter than negotiating to have Palestinians build Jewish settlements, which is what he did. Okay? We need to be educated so that we can make a list of demands that is absolutely just, and then we could drum into the public mind over and over and over again and not waver from it. Then we stay on the path of being principled.